for your attention during those brief housekeeping announcements. At this point, it is my great pleasure to introduce our presenter today, Erin Skinner. Erin is a Integrative and Functional Registered Dietitian. She's a nutritionist and an author. We encountered Erin through her column in the Paleo Magazine, where she regularly writes the Research Roundup, and we thought she had some very interesting things to say, and as we learned more about her, we thought it would be a wonderful opportunity to have her join us on Terry Talks Nutrition to share information about how she helps people recover from gastrointestinal, autoimmune, and metabolic disorders through the power of their diets. She has a lot of interesting information to share, and she is hopefully as happy to be here as we are to have her. So at this point, I would like to turn things over to Erin, and thank you very much for your attention during those housekeeping announcements, and welcome, Erin. Thank you for joining us today on Terry Talks Nutrition.
Hi, good morning, and thank you so much for having me. I am so thrilled to be here, and thank you to everyone who's joining us. I'm really excited to share with you all this really critical information about really a incredibly innovative way that IBS is now being treated that I think is not well understood enough. You know, IBS is so predominant that there's no reason why this life-changing approach shouldn't be understood by everyone. So I'm doing my best to get the word out there, and so this is a thrill for me to come and do this today. So I'm going to probably move a little bit quick through these points because there's just a lot of great information that I'd like to get out to you. If it's a little bit too quick for you, hang on for the Q&A in the end. That's part of why I'm moving fairly quickly so that we can make sure to have time for plenty of questions at the end. And then obviously watch that replay if you want to kind of go over something a little bit for the second time. Okay, but basically what we're going to go over today is just some basics about IBS or Irritable Bowel Syndrome so that we're all on the same page about exactly what we're talking about here when we say IBS. We'll definitely go into the scientific research that supports the low FODMAP diet as a first line of treatment for IBS. We'll talk about who's a good fit for this and who isn't, what the heck a FODMAP actually is, how it actually works with this approach, and then of course how to get help and support if you need to go ahead and do that, okay? So first of all, I just want to say if you do have gastrointestinal problems, I understand it's a complete nightmare. My practice is composed of almost solely people who have, at least in part, as part of their problem, gastrointestinal problems. So if you've ever felt in the traditional medical setting like your gastrointestinal problems or your IBS were a little bit dismissed, don't think for a second that that's the way that you should be treated. I know that this actually affects not only your day-to-day life, but it affects your professional life, it affects your personal life, it affects the way that you feel about food and the way that your mood is and the way that you approach eating, and it actually can cause a lot of depression and anxiety for some people. So it's a real problem. So, you know, that's why I'm here, because there is such an effective way to address this that I want to help you to learn more about. Also, another great point that I'd like to make is that you're not alone if you do have IBS. Around 20% of adults do have it. Not 20% are diagnosed, and I'll get more into that in a little bit later in the presentation. But around 1 in 5 adults have this, and the great thing about that, the silver lining, I guess you could say, is that because so many people struggle with this, there's actually been a ton of research on it, and that's basically where the low FODMAP approach has come from, is an increased funding and research around this to try to get this under control. It has a huge effect on our, honestly, economy and the cost of healthcare, which is a topic for another day, but there are many people struggling with this. So great news, there is hope for this. I'll get into the specifics in a second, but I get over 90% remission rates with IBS in my practice. In the literature, they find rates almost that great with the low FODMAP diet. There's definitely, this definitely can be improved and even reversed. So hang in there. I'm going to give you the top way that this can be handled, but there's even some other ways to do it if even the low FODMAP diet doesn't get you complete resolution. Also stick on for the end, because I'm going to offer you a bonus for free that's going to help you if you want to learn more about the low FODMAP diet and try it out. So hang on until the end of the talk, and I'll set you up with that, okay? All right, so let's move into it. So IBS, Irritable Bowel Syndrome, what is that? Some basic stuff on this. This is just a very general overview, but basically we're talking about symptoms of cramping, abdominal pain, bloating with or without distension, gas, and then diarrhea and or constipation. Either can be a part of it. In fact, there are several subtypes of IBS. If you've been diagnosed or worked up for this, you probably know there's IBS-C, constipation, D, diarrhea, M for mixed or unclassified. A few really critical things to know about IBS. One, it's a diagnosis of exclusion. And what that means is that if you go to your healthcare provider and you say, I've got these abdominal or gastrointestinal symptoms, they will rule out a bunch of other things that they can test for. So they can test for celiac. They'll rule that out. They can test for inflammatory bowel disease like Crohn's and ulcerative colitis and cancer. They'll rule those out. If they rule out everything else and they still can't figure out what's going on, they call it IBS. But really, with one small exception that's kind of new to the market, there isn't really a test for IBS. It really just means we couldn't figure out what was causing it, so we're calling it IBS. And the reason why that's important to understand is that there's actually many different possible underlying causes of IBS. So for one person, what works, it might not be the same thing that works for someone else, although the low FODMAP diet is shown across the board to generally improve this for almost everyone. I'll get into a second more on this, but it's important to understand this because it can feel very dismissive, that basically they've given up on you, they can't figure out what it is, they're just almost dismissing it as IBS, if that makes sense. Specifically, when they consider to move into a diagnosis of IBS, they'll say, do you meet this Rome-4 criteria? And basically, I'll summarize it for you. It means that you've had these symptoms for at least 6 months, and it means that for the last 3 months of that, you've had them at least for 1 day per week, okay? So you've got these symptoms, we can't figure out what the actual cause is, it's happening this often, we call it IBS. Downsides of this, there's not really a great medical treatment for it. If you've gone through this, you probably understand that, or you probably experienced that. You'll probably get some medication that doesn't really improve it. You might get a diet recommendation that helps or that doesn't, but in the end, this isn't really well handled in the traditional medical setting. So bottom line, it's very frustrating. You go through all this testing, you don't get a diagnosis that's very satisfying, and you don't really get a treatment that's very effective. If you have IBS and you've been going through this, I know you're like, I know this. I've experienced this firsthand. So basically, the solution to this frustrating situation, that's why I'm here to share this with you, the low FODMAP diet. And don't just take my word for it. We're going to get into the evidence, but it is extremely effective at improving and even reversing irritable bowel syndrome. So the scientific evidence for this in the medical literature that's peer-reviewed in journals, I'm going to go again very quickly through this, and if you want to see the full text article, look at the bottom where I put that DOI link. You can just type that or copy that into your browser, and it'll pull up the full text article. But I'm going to go through a few of the studies on this that are the most impactful. Back in 2014 is when the low FODMAP diet really started to pick up pace in terms of its prevalence and the evidence supporting it. And that's when the American College of Gastroenterology, which is kind of a big governing organization for the standard of care for IBS, they started to say the low FODMAP diet shows promise for IBS, okay? And then that was a summary paper that they published. That was actually a big statement for them. And then fast forward 3 years, in 2017, a review paper looking at all the literature up to that date, published in the journal Gut, said, quote, now, there's convincing evidence for the low FODMAP diet, at that time with 50 to 80% having a good response to the diet. Okay, so that might not sound huge, but the journal Gut being prestigious for these clinicians to make a statement like that, is a really big statement. That's really a bigger response than even any medication on the market, okay? So moving on, more clinical trials. For example, a 4-week study found that around 70% of IBS patients on the diet showed adequate control of their symptoms compared to only 23% on a habitual diet group. Another study, significant improvement of all the symptoms specifically, bloating, abdominal pain, wind, gas, stool consistency after just 3 weeks on the diet. And honestly, if you're doing it well, within a week, people feel really pretty incredible. Another clinical trial in 2017, again, the journal Gut. This was a big game changer also because not only did they find significant improvement of IBS, but they found an 8-fold decrease in histamine, which is a known compound that's produced as part of the trigger of IBS symptoms. So that's kind of giving us an insight into part of the mechanism of IBS and how this could be effective. And I'll get more into that a little bit later. But that was a big article showing that, hey, you know, it's this old school idea that IBS is in people's heads and that they're, you know, it's like a mental condition. That's done. That's completely outdated and wrong. There are actual chemical changes in the gut happening, and the low FODMAP diet is improving those. More clinical trials, 2015, Gastroenterology Journal. This was big because not only did they compare the low FODMAP diet to just regular IBS people, but they actually took a group and gave them the traditional advice for IBS diet. So they said things like avoid caffeine, avoid gassy foods like broccoli and cauliflower and beans, avoid large meals and fat. So they took that group and compared them to the low FODMAP diet and found that that low FODMAP group still outperformed that other group in terms of their improvement. Okay, and then they did that again in 2017, and they found that even compared to that traditional IBS advice, the low FODMAP diet improved not just symptoms, but the things that actually really matter, if you think about it, are quality of life, anxiety, activity impairment, just the ability for people to live their lives well and to feel good. Those obviously improve along with symptom improvement, of course. And then getting to the end here, this was a big one this year, 2018, a systematic review and meta-analysis. Okay, so this is the clinicians of gastroenterology looking at all of the literature on the low FODMAP diet up until this date, and they came out with a big statement. They said a low FODMAP diet is effective in reducing symptoms in IBS patients. That really hasn't been said for any diet ever. So it's kind of a big statement from them to come out with that. And then the final point on the literature that I want to make is there has been some concern around the low FODMAP diet that it could possibly affect the microbiome, which is that colony of healthy gut bacteria in your colon, because it does reduce the amount of fiber in the diet for some people if they're not doing it well. So they went ahead and did a study on this in 2017. They found that, okay, when we gave the low FODMAP diet to a group of people with IBS, they went into remission, they maintained it for at least 6 months, and then with the help of a registered dietitian, they were able to eat a normal fiber intake, which is a big statement because the average American eats about half of the normal fiber intake. So they were eating twice as much fiber as the average American on a low FODMAP diet. So low FODMAP doesn't necessarily mean low fiber. They maintained their improvement on that high fiber intake, and then they went even farther and actually analyzed these people's microbiomes and saw that there was no change seen, there was no damage done to the microbiome when they were on the low FODMAP diet, doing it correctly under the guidance of a dietitian. Their conclusions in this paper were that, yep, a low FODMAP diet improves the symptoms, it improves the quality of life, it does not affect the microbial diversity or the health of the microbiome in these patients. With the help of a dietitian, they can increase their fiber intake to recommended levels without their symptoms worsening. So really there's no need to worry about an effect on the microbiome if it's done well with the right help, if that makes sense. So bottom line on the literature, in the studies, they find 70 to 80% of people with IBS experience not just improvement, remission on a low FODMAP diet. In my practice, I do this very well with people. I get over 90%. That's more powerful than the effect of any medication available on the market or any diet available in the world, okay? And study after study says work with a dietitian for best results. And what that means is really you need to be working with somebody that knows what they're doing. Traditionally, the low FODMAP diet is taught to dietitians as part of, you know, that's who generally they go through as like the clinicians to teach this diet. But there are other types of providers who know the low FODMAP diet well. The important thing is just to have professional guidance so that you can execute it in the right way, okay? So you might be thinking if you have IBS that this sounds pretty good. Can I get some of this? Well, let's talk about who actually is a good candidate for this and who isn't. So you're a perfect fit for this if you meet all this criteria. You have IBS, your healthcare provider approves of you doing it, you're ready to commit the time and dedicate yourself to doing this completely and correctly, and you have a good support network in place. Well, in that case, you're perfect. Some people aren't quite perfect, but can still hugely benefit from this. So what I mean is that, say maybe you have IBS symptoms, but you're not one of those people that has been able to get a diagnosis. 20% of people have IBS, but only 5 to 7% of the population has been diagnosed. So if you're part of that maybe 12% of the population that has IBS without a diagnosis, you still could benefit from the low FODMAP diet. But maybe you don't have the ability to get a formal medical evaluation. Maybe you don't have access to a healthcare provider that can do that. You could still benefit, but in this case, it is more critical to get some support just to make sure that you're doing it safely, okay? And then finally, these are the people that really, really should work with a healthcare provider before going forward. If you have a history of an eating disorder, anyone under the age of 18, if you're pregnant or breastfeeding, underweight, or under medical management for some other medical condition like diabetes or renal disease or cardiovascular disease, definitely talk to a healthcare provider before you proceed in these cases, okay? So if you have more questions about that, again, ask me in the questions section or contact me. But I'd like to move on now to this word, FODMAP. What does that even mean? That is such a strange word. Let's talk about it. FODMAP is actually an acronym, okay? So, and I'll explain it more in a second, but basically what we're talking about here is certain types of carbohydrates that are in food, and some of these carbohydrate types are fibers, and some are certain types of sugars. So not all fibers and sugars are FODMAPs, but some of them are, okay? And the common thread between all FODMAPs is that they're not broken down and absorbed very well by our digestive tract, okay? And the result of that at the end is the symptoms we already know and have talked about, the symptoms of IBS, abdominal pain, reflux, bloating, gas, cramping, diarrhea, constipation. Sounds familiar, right? Those are the IBS symptoms. So what that actually stands for is FODMAP, fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols. You might be thinking, that sounds like another language. I don't know what we're talking about. I don't think I eat any of those. Okay, well, let's look at it this way. Have you recently had any of these foods? Garlic and onion, fruits and vegetables, honey, medications, anything with wheat, protein bars, yogurts, milk, gum and candy. The list goes on and on. Soda, milk, tea. If you look at it like this, you realize, okay, these are all high FODMAP foods. So basically, if you're living in the world and you're not already on a low FODMAP diet, you're eating FODMAPs. They are everywhere. And one thing about the low FODMAP diet to really understand is that it's not very intuitive. So it's not like, if I said to you, okay, you need to go on a gluten-free diet, most people kind of understand, okay, that means I'm just not going to be able to eat anything with wheat. Or if I said a dairy-free diet, people understand what dairy foods are. But with FODMAPs, some vegetables are high and some vegetables are low. Some fruits are high and some fruits are low. So, you know, it can be a little bit more nuanced and hard to learn, especially without the right support, if that makes sense. But basically, here's how this happens with FODMAPs causing symptoms. You can kind of think of food molecules, anything you eat, like a lock. And then your body produces these enzymes that act like the key. And the key opens the lock. The enzyme opens the food molecule and digests it, okay? But with FODMAPs, your body doesn't have that enzyme to open that lock, to open that molecule and digest it, okay? So what happens is the undigested FODMAPs get into your GI tract. For people without IBS, they handle this very well. For people with IBS, their gut is more sensitive, which is probably a topic for another day, but they're more sensitive to these, and it produces IBS symptoms. Specifically what happens, two things. First of all, those undigested FODMAPs in the gut have what's called high osmolality, which means that they're pulling water into your GI tract and filling your gut with water. And then the second consequence is that any bacteria living in your gut, so your microbiome, and then something that some people have called SIBO, where there's bacteria in the small intestine, but basically any bacteria in your gut is going to feast on these FODMAPs like crazy. It's like fast food for this bacteria, and they just eat it all up, and their waste product is gas. So these bacteria are producing a ton of gas. Water is getting pulled in. You can probably see where I'm going with this. You have a gut full of water and gas. It causes the symptoms of IBS, okay? Here's the solution to this. Following the low FODMAP protocol, basically you're cutting FODMAPs not completely out of your diet, but way down. It allows you to find your broadest possible diet. It minimizes that gas and water that gets into your GI tract. And then again, like we went through in the literature, you're going to get improvement at least 80% of the time. In fact, remission 70 to 80% of the time if it's done well. Okay? So you might be thinking, this sounds pretty good. How can I cut down on these FODMAPs in my diet and have my symptoms go away from my IBS? I would love to live my life without this. Let's talk about a few broad concepts about the low FODMAP diet that are like critical to understand, okay? Before I even tell you about foods or anything, we need to understand these concepts. First of all, the low FODMAP diet is a protocol. So there are phases and steps you go through to do it. And it's a learning protocol. And what that means is that as you go through the steps, you're learning what FODMAPs affect you the most and which FODMAPs affect you the least. So your goal at the end of this learning protocol is to get to your own personalized diet. So I might get 2 patients that have IBS. I might take them both through the protocol, and at the end they both feel great. They'll both be on the low FODMAP diet, but they'll both be eating different foods because you've learned to get to your own personalized version of the low FODMAP diet. Okay, so specifically, it's also an elimination diet. And what that means, this is so critical to understand, is that with an elimination diet, you take foods out, but then you have to add them back in a systematic way. So again, with that protocol, there's multiple steps. There's the taking out, and there's the adding back, and that's how you learn what your own personal version is, okay? So specifically, there's 4 stages to this, and I'm going to go into these in brief just so that you can kind of get an overview of how this works. But then finally, before I do that, one last concept that we need to really, really, really understand is that nothing's completely off limits with a low FODMAP diet. So going back before, we talked about the gluten-free diet. If you have celiac disease, or if you're gluten sensitive without celiac disease, either one, if you're on a gluten-free diet, you are 100% off wheat. Like, you're not having any of it. The low FODMAP diet is not like that. Actually, really anything can be eaten. It's more important to think about this concept of like a bucket, okay? So imagine your gut is a bucket. Every time you eat, you're putting some FODMAPs into that bucket. And then you feel fine until your bucket is overfilling, basically. So if your bucket's half full, you're okay. If your bucket's 3/4 full, you're okay. As soon as that bucket overflows, IBS symptoms, okay? So the critical thing is to basically go through the protocol and learn how much of what type of FODMAP makes your bucket overflow, because for different people, it's going to be different types of FODMAPs that do that. Okay, so how do you figure that out? Hopefully that doesn't sound too difficult and complicated. It's not if you just get on a good system, okay? And that's the key to my success with people on this, is getting them on a system that makes sense, that's easy to implement, that takes out all the confusion and guesswork, okay? So your end goal at the end of this is to do it quickly, so you're not guessing around for years around what you can eat and not eat. Get to an individualized diet that's specific to you, that eliminates your symptoms. Obviously, that's the goal, to get rid of your symptoms. And then, really important too, have the least possible restrictions. Restricting your food isn't fun, and it's not usually very healthy to have an extremely limited diet. So getting the most variety in your diet is also a big goal, okay? So specifically, let's talk about what this system actually looks like. There's those 4 phases we talked about, and the first phase is called the prep phase. It's very important. It's often skipped, so I always like to emphasize this just so that it doesn't get skipped. But basically what happens in the prep phase is you prepare yourself for success so that it can go well and that you can get the best results out of it. A few things to think about here are going to be getting your medical clearance if that's possible. think back to those slides where I said who's the best fit and who probably really needs the most guidance. Wherever you're at on that spectrum, will determine how important that medical clearance is. But talking to your healthcare provider if you have the ability to do that, basically. Figuring out what system you're going to follow. I'm giving my system to you, but there's others out there that I'll show you in a second. But getting on a specific system and figuring out who you're going to follow so that you're not following 10 different Pinterest infographics and getting confused, basically. The timing, if you pick a time when you're less busy and when you're less stressed and when there's less travel, nobody ever has a perfect time like that, but really, the best you can do on this, the better, basically, with picking the right timing. And then having your support network in place, so making sure that you're including the people that can support you through this. And unfortunately, some people have people in their life that might be unsupportive, making sure that that you figure out a way to manage that and prevent them from harming your success. Okay? Phase 2, this is probably the most done. A lot of people will just kind of come in and only do phase 2, and then they'll say the low FODMAP diet didn't work for me. Well, if you only do 1 out of 4 phases, then it doesn't work very well. But the elimination phase is basically where you go low FODMAP. So you're going to be limiting your FODMAPs in your diet to a significant degree. This period is going to be at least 2 weeks long, and it can go up to 6, but it really shouldn't go beyond 6. I sometimes see people who have been doing this for months or years. That doesn't work, okay? New problems can come from that. So 2 to 6 weeks, really critical to follow the system. I'm laying out mine, but again, I'll show you some other ones you can find. The end here, usually people will feel like a new person, and that's why I have a hard time getting people to move beyond this phase, because they feel so good that they're really afraid to move beyond it. But really, this is the part where generally people have like a life-changing experience, to be honest. So when I say what other systems can you follow, this is very brief, and get in touch if you need more help. But basically, some people are fortunate enough to go to their doctor and say, I want that low FODMAP diet, or maybe the doctor will say that. They'll put in a referral to a dietitian. Maybe there's a dietitian in the area that's trained in this. Not all dietitians are trained in this, so it has to be a dietitian with training and experience with a low FODMAP diet. And then healthcare insurance will cover that. If that's you, great. But my practice is full of people who did not have the ability to get that for one reason or another. If that's you, here's some other options. Patsy Katsos and Kate Scarlotta are 2 dietitians who do this really well. They've been doing it for a long time. I'm not affiliate with them or anything. I just know that they do a great job. Patsy has a great book. You can find it on her website. Kate has some great free handouts on her website. So you can go to those websites to get some great information. I think a non-negotiable thing if you're going to do this is the Monash University app. They are the place that has basically pioneered the low FODMAP diet and has done all the initial research on this. They have an app where you can look up the FODMAP content of foods. It's not free, but it's not expensive either. It's less than $10, and all of the proceeds go back into the research. So that's a great resource. You can be in the grocery store and say, I wonder if I can eat bananas. Pull up that app, look up bananas, and there you go. And then at the end, I'm going to tell you what I think is actually the best system to follow and how you can get access to that, okay? If you want to just, not even get any resources and just really quickly figure out if this is even helpful for you, I kind of drummed up this idea that you could do. And basically, for a week, you could cut these foods out, and these aren't all the foods that have FODMAPs, but if you are sensitive to FODMAPs, you'll feel better if you do this. For a week, take out garlic and onion, wheat, dairy, other than hard cheeses, almost all fruits and vegetables except for very small servings, and processed food. This might leave you wondering, what could I even eat? So this isn't really probably the best way to do this, and I'm going to give you a better idea in a second. But basically, if you just want a really quick way to test this, you could do this. But don't do this more than a week. It's really not safe because it's not a complete diet, okay? But for a week, you could do this. If you feel different, if you feel better, you're onto something with the low FODMAP diet, and it's time to get on an actual system and do it for real. If you don't feel any different, that's a sign that it might not be the right approach for you, and you could probably try to work with somebody to find a better approach to your symptoms. Okay, so as promised, I'm going to offer this bonus for you. I've created this meal plan, and tons of people have done it and had incredible success with it. You can get it at recoveryfromibs.com. It's basically a 1-week meal plan that includes exactly what to buy, exactly what to eat for 3 meals and 2 snacks every day, and exactly all the recipes you need to go on this elimination phase of the diet for a week. So this is probably the best way to test it out. Go to that link, get the meal plan. It's free. Follow it for a week and see if you feel a big difference. If you do, you know that it's time to really do the low FODMAP protocol for real. Okay, so moving on to phase 3, the reintroduction phase, really critical. When I told you about those studies that showed that people didn't have an adverse effect to their microbiome on the low FODMAP diet, it was because they worked with a dietitian to do this part well. The reintroduction phase is where you bring back FODMAPs in a systematic way so that you can broaden your diet. It's going to last 4 to 8 weeks. My baseline protocol is a 6-week process, but you can go a little bit faster or slower depending. You're going to add back those FODMAP types. Remember how that's an acronym. So oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides. You're going to add those back following a system, one at a time. Following the protocol will tell you which ones you're sensitive to and which ones you're not, because some people, well, everybody is more sensitive to one type of FODMAP than another. The end goal here is to still feel great like you did in the last phase, but then to also have a broader diet, because it's never fun to go to a party and just have your crackers or whatever you brought that is what you can eat. You want to be able to eat as many foods as possible, right? All right, the 4th and final phase, I'm going to be completely honest here. I invented this, and the reason why is I've done this with hundreds of people now, and I've seen the way it actually works. There's great support for the elimination phase. There's not great support for the reintroduction phase. People are kind of left to do it almost on their own. And then there's nothing. But really, there's this kind of 4th phase where you're done with the reintroductions, but you're still really figuring it out. And so I've actually turned this into an official phase. I'm doing it, and I actually provide support and guidance along with this. So basically what it looks like is it's ongoing. You're still adding back new foods or increasing the quantity, so you're experimenting with foods that maybe have multiple types of FODMAPs in them, because yes, unfortunately that is a thing. You're experimenting with preparation methods. Maybe something affects you differently, steamed versus roasted versus fried. You're experimenting with serving sizes. Really important here is to continue to have support and resources. And community support, I find, becomes even more critical here because you're going through this on an ongoing basis. It's nice to know other people that are doing it with you to bounce your ideas off of and talk about your struggles with. Okay, so community support is big here. The end goal is to feel great and have a broader diet and have more confidence. So you feel like you can go out to a restaurant and order with confidence. You can go to a party and know exactly what to do. You can plan your meals for the week. No problem. So having that confidence is the goal. Okay, so this is the last little part that I'm going to talk about, and then I'm going to open it up to questions. So if you have a burning question, hang in there. We're almost to the end, but basically how to get help for best results. Here are the things that professional help will get you. First of all, increase safety and oversight. So we talked about supporting the microbiome, but there's also nutrient density. There's also making sure that other possible medical problems are getting ruled out and addressed that could be coming up. So that's really one big benefit. And then another thing, this is huge, you guys. I've had so many people come to my practice and say, oh, I tried the low FODMAP diet, but I got so confused because I got one blog post told me that I could eat avocados, and then another blog post told me I couldn't, or one blog post told me to do this for 1 week, and another blog post told me to do it for 4 weeks. I don't know what to do. When you work with a professional, you've got clarity and confidence. You know you're doing the system. You know you're doing the right thing. You just follow their guidance, okay? So that takes out a lot of the confusion. You'll get better resources. That's a related thing, but just basically instead of trying to piece it together from different conflicting sources of YouTube or Pinterest or whatever, you're getting resources that all go together and make sense and that have the updated information, because low FODMAP diet is fairly new. They're still coming out with new information about foods all the time, and sometimes even changing the FODMAP content that is updated basically. You've got a sounding board with a professional. The professional is going to hear your struggles help you troubleshoot, and even support you just emotionally through it, because it's not always easy to do something like this, especially if you're alone. Finally, they'll be looking at your diet quality to make sure that you're safe and that you're getting the nutrients that you need. Okay. Downsides. You probably didn't think I was going here, but I am. There are definitely downsides to trying to work with a professional, and here's what they are. There's not a lot of us out there. Not all dietitians are trained in the low FODMAP diet, and most people are not dietitians. So there's very few, actually, dietitians who are doing this that do it well, so they can be kind of hard to find, okay? If you are lucky enough to find somebody, it's hard to fit it into your schedule. A lot of times you've got to work with them during the workday. It's hard enough when you're missing, on average, people with IBS miss 2 days of work per month just because of their symptoms. So to miss more work, to work with somebody, even more difficult. So scheduling. And then finally, the expense. So I went online recently and I Googled, low FODMAP dietitian, and I just looked up their package prices, and I averaged the first 3 that I found. It came to over $700 just to get started with somebody to pay a dietitian to do this. So those are really the primary downsides to doing this, okay? So here's my solution that I've created to come up with this, because I and other dietitians that I know are maxed out. My practice has been waitlisted for close to a year, and I know that many others aren't taking new clients either because there's just so much demand for this. So I created basically this online course that's an A to Z blueprint for how to do this. It includes support from me. It includes an online Facebook community. It includes meal plans. It includes the videos for exactly how to do every phase, every step. And then there's tons of awesome handouts, resources, worksheets, blueprints, cheat sheets for the things that I know are the common sticking points. So how to have work week lunches quick and at the ready that are low FODMAP, how to snack, how to eat out at a restaurant. I've covered all that stuff in here. It's really more than I can ever support a private client, because for them to pay for this much time with me would cost them thousands of dollars. But this is less than $300 to get this. So if you want what I think is the best way, affordability and support-wise, to do the low FODMAP diet, you can check it out. It's at recoveryfromibs.com/course. So the link is there if you want to learn more about that. Okay, so I'm going to open it up to your questions. As I said, I moved pretty quick. So if there's something that wasn't clear to you, go ahead and ask me. Or if you want to ask me about something else related to IBS or low FODMAP, fire away.
Well, thank you so much, Erin. That was really, really interesting, and it's a way of thinking about diet and IBS that you're right. I think a lot of people is new to them. It's a new way of thinking about it.
Yeah.
And so, folks, I'm sure you have questions. I see there's one already in the Q&A box. So please go ahead and just type in your questions under the Q&A, and we will try to get to them as quickly as we can. While we're waiting for folks to enter their questions, I just have one comment myself, which is, you talked a little bit about fiber, and I think maybe a simplistic way of thinking about fiber was, for some people fiber is great, and for some people fiber is not.
Yeah.
And so when you look at the literature on fiber and IBS, they're like, well, you don't know until you try. Mm-hmm. So how do you feel about, when you think about, well, I have IBS and I have constant diarrhea, so I should get more fiber?
I would never tell somebody to do that. My goal, because almost always that's harmful, mm-hmm. basically. So, but then again, gut health is the most important thing. So the end goal is to be able to work up to at least a normal fiber intake. But I would never, the outdated thing that what happens is basically somebody goes into their doctor, they've got IBS, they get diagnosed, and then the doctor will say, oh, well, you just need to eat more fiber, especially if they have constipation, they'll say that. And then, mm-hmm. Even diarrhea, people get that recommendation. And then they'll go home and try it, and it makes them severely worse, because most high-fiber foods are high FODMAP. So basically, they've been told the opposite of what they need to be doing. However, you can you can basically have a win-win with the low FODMAP diet. You can get on a low FODMAP diet, and then there are low FODMAP foods that have fiber in them. So you can actually, at the end, get up to a higher fiber intake than what you were on before, but still be low FODMAP. And that is basically what they were testing in those research studies, to make sure that this was possible so that people can do it well without harming their microbiome, basically. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Could you give an example? What would be an example of a food that's high in fiber but it's low FODMAP?
Yeah, good question. So, like this morning, I was testing out a new meal plan that I'm making, and buckwheat flour is low FODMAP. So I made these buckwheat pancakes, and those have a significant amount of fiber in them, and they're a low FODMAP pancake. And then on top of that, you can have basically, if you want to get more into the specific protocol of the elimination phase, we can. But the way it works is you have, if you're on the elimination phase, you'll avoid the very high FODMAP foods during that short period of time, and then the low FODMAP foods are one of two things. They're either unlimited or they're bold. And if they're bold, you can have 2 of those up to a certain serving size per sitting. So like I'm having my pancakes, I can have 2 bold items with that, and like bananas are an example of a bold item, and bananas are high fiber as well, or relatively high in fiber. And you can have half of a banana as like the serving size. So I had my buckwheat pancakes with half a banana sliced on top. Right there, you got much more fiber in that breakfast than you would even get from like a bowl of fiber cereal, if that makes sense.
Oh, that's very interesting.
Isn't that interesting? Because you think of FODMAPs and fiber as being the same thing, but they're really not,
Okay. I want to go through our question and answer queue. There was one question about probiotics.
Yeah.
So this person says that, probiotics are frequently recommended, but personally, every time this person has tried adding probiotics, their IBS symptoms get worse.
Oh, my gosh. Sarah, I love your question, and I saw you coming. Is it okay if I advance to these slides? I have these secret slides on this.
Good. Go ahead.
All right, here we go. Okay, boom. Sarah, we're on the same page. Okay, so probiotics can definitely help for some people and not for others. And I'm moving on to the probiotic slide here. So here we go. They've studied this extensively with IBS, and remember, with the low FODMAP diet, they're seeing 70 to 80% of people achieve remission in the literature, okay? With probiotics, they're seeing 1 in 5 people experience benefit, okay? So only 20%. So 20% is way lower than 70 to 80%, right? And the reason why they still come out and recommend that you try it is that how depressing is this? 20% of people getting benefit from probiotics, that's still better than most medications. So they just don't have much to throw at IBS in the traditional healthcare setting, honestly. They don't have much to throw at it. So when they find something that helps 20% of the time, they still recommend you try it because 1 in 5 people will get a benefit. In my practice, I do get more than 20% success rate with probiotics, and the biggest reason for that is that a few things. These are the strains that have been studied and shown to be effective on a significant level for IBS, okay? However, usually if a doctor tells you try a probiotic, they won't give you this list. So they'll just say, oh, try a probiotic, and you might go out and get one that's not from these strains, okay? So that's one way that this can go on. Another problem that can happen is that people who are sensitive to histamine, like we talked about earlier in the presentation, some of these strains will increase histamine. So if that's you, then you're going to be among that 80% of people that don't get a benefit from this, because the probiotic is actually increasing histamine, whereas the low FODMAP diet decreases histamine. Okay, there are strains of probiotics that don't increase histamine, and that's part of why I get better success with probiotics, is if I have somebody where I even suspect that histamine is part of the problem, I'll make sure to give them that probiotic that doesn't increase histamine, okay? But any normal kind of like you walk into a GNC type of probiotic is going to have those histamine-producing strains in it, okay? So those are kind of the primary points on probiotics. Sarah, does that answer your question? Oh, okay, good. I saw your thank you. So good. I hope that makes sense. If you can, I would say, find something like this. If you think you're sensitive to histamine, then even try that low histamine probiotic. Get in touch with me if you have questions on that. But again, it can help in one out of 5 cases, but the low FODMAP diet, more like 4 to 5 out of 5, basically.
All right. Okay, so here's a question from a person who says that she has a high metabolism. She weighs just 90 pounds. She had her gallbladder removed and cannot process fat.
Yes.
So she's been on the low FODMAP diet, but she needs some kind of fat. What is the best fat that she should try?
Okay, I love this question. So I do a lot of stool testing, like functional stool testing in my practice. And honestly, for somebody like you might not even need to do that. But basically, a high proportion of people with IBS do have either fat malabsorption, or like you, with your gallbladder removed, you don't have a way to store that and release it at the appropriate times. It's just kind of leaking out all the time. I get huge success with supporting with basically lipase and other related enzymes. So we talked about how, FODMAPs there's not an enzyme to break that food molecule down. Well, fat's the same way. Fat needs to be broken down by a fat-specific enzyme. So for somebody like you that isn't releasing fat at the appropriate time, or for somebody that maybe doesn't produce enough enzymes to break down fat, before I even try diet, or like right at the outset when we even start with diet, I'll start with a really good quality digestive enzyme that's going to help break down that fat. If you get that stool test, that even helps to like further show how much and what type you might need. But for somebody like you with your gallbladder removed, it's pretty obvious that that's what you need to do. I would just try the quality enzyme like on the outset, if that makes sense. And then your question too is, you need to have some type of fat. We didn't even really talk about food quality, but that's another way that the low FODMAP diet can go wrong sometimes. There's even some like really famous low FODMAP books that have like atrocious diet quality in them. It's really sad to see, but it's really critical. And what I do with my patients and my clients is that I combine the low FODMAP diet with diet quality, and like fats are one part of that. So technically any fat is low FODMAP, but really you're going to want to stay away from processed industrial oils. So this isn't relating to how well you tolerate it, but the quality types of fat would be either olive oil, coconut oil, tallow from a grass-fed source, grass-fed meats, the avocado oil that's good quality, fish. Those are the quality fats that really should be the focus, and not things like canola oil, vegetable oil, margarine, trans fats. Those are all the basically inflammatory fats that should be avoided. But the key is to, if you might be frustrated hearing that, saying, well, I've tried these quality fats and like I can't absorb them or digest them well. That's where the enzymes come in. So the key is to support your digestion to the degree where you can consume those quality fats. Does that answer your question?
I thought it was a great answer. So hopefully our listener did too.
All right. I think it's Mitzi. Sorry if I said it wrong. I hope that helped, Mitzi.
Yeah. All right. I think that takes us through our questions.
Awesome.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Erin. That was a great talk. I'd just like to remind our listeners that if they would like to hear the replay, or they would like to have a friend come back and listen to make sure that you can find us on the Terry Talks Nutrition as well as the Terry Talks Nutrition channel on YouTube, and you will find our collection of archives of past events, including this one. We usually have it posted about 24 hours after the event. And you can also go on to the Terry Talks Nutrition page for more information and lifestyle tips from Terry himself. So again, I want to thank you all for taking the time to join us today. We do appreciate it. Thank you so much, Erin, for being with us. And we hope we see you again at a future Terry Talks Nutrition event. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.